North Africa, 1943. The desert sun beats mercilessly on convoys of defeated German troops shuffling through the dust. Among them walks a young woman who never fired a single shot in this war. Margarete Weiss, everyone calls her Greta, is 25 years old. She comes from Baden-Württemberg, a region in southwestern Germany known for its vineyards and orchards, where her family had cultivated fruit for generations. When the war began, Greta didn't enlist to fight. She was drafted into the German Women's Auxiliary Service, assigned to logistics and food preservation. Her war was fought in kitchens and storage facilities, not battlefields. Her expertise lay in fermentation. She knew how to transform fresh fruit into preserved goods that could last months. She understood the delicate chemistry of turning apples into cider, grapes into vinegar, cabbage into sauerkraut. Skills passed down through generations of German households now served the Afrika Korps, keeping soldiers fed in the hostile North African climate. Greta worked behind the lines, attached to support units that followed Rommel's forces across Libya and Tunisia. She managed food supplies, supervised fermentation processes, and ensured that perishable goods were transformed into something that could survive the brutal heat. It was unglamorous work, invisible work, but essential. In May 1943, everything collapsed. The Allied forces had cornered the remaining German and Italian troops in Tunisia. The ports of Tunis and Bizerte fell. Supply lines disintegrated. Units that had fought for months suddenly found themselves surrounded, cut off, with nowhere to retreat. The decision came swiftly from command: surrender. Greta's unit gave up without resistance. They had no ammunition to spare, no fuel for vehicles, no food to ration. The officers laid down their weapons. The support staff, including Greta, stood in formation as British and American troops moved through their positions, processing prisoners by the hundreds. She remembers the silence. After months of artillery fire, aircraft engines, and military orders shouted across compounds, the sudden quiet felt unnatural. Men and women stood together, their uniforms covered in dust, watching as their captors organized them into columns. Greta wasn't classified as a combatant. The official designation read, Enemy Non-Combat Personnel Attached to Military Unit. It was a bureaucratic distinction that would shape everything that followed. She wasn't a soldier. She was a captured civilian who had been working for the military. The Americans took custody of her group. British forces handled the bulk of prisoner processing, but certain categories, particularly female auxiliary personnel, were transferred to American control. Greta didn't understand why at the time. She simply followed instructions, boarding trucks that carried her away from the desert. She didn't know where she was going. None of them did. Rumors circulated through the prisoner columns. Some said they would be sent to labor camps in Britain. Others whispered about prisons in remote parts of Africa. A few optimists suggested they might be repatriated through neutral countries. Greta said nothing. She had learned to stay quiet, to observe, to wait. Her life had been disrupted by forces beyond her control. All she could do now was survive whatever came next. She was not arrested for a crime. She was captured because she was in the wrong place when the war ended for her unit. The journey across the Atlantic took 3 weeks. Greta and approximately 200 other German prisoners were loaded onto a transport ship in Casablanca. Most were men from support units, mechanics, clerks, medical orderlies, but there were a dozen women from various auxiliary services. They were kept separate from the male prisoners, confined to a lower deck section that smelled of salt water and diesel fuel. The accommodations were basic but not brutal. Bunks stacked 3 high, minimal privacy, constant noise from the ship's engines. They received 2 meals a day, simple but adequate. No one starved, no one was beaten, but the uncertainty gnawed at them constantly. Where were they being taken? What would happen when they arrived? The women traded theories during the long hours. Some believed they were being sent to punishment camps, places where they would be forced to perform hard labor as retribution for Germany's actions. Others thought they might be used as bargaining chips, eventually exchanged for Allied prisoners held in Germany. Greta listened but rarely contributed. She had seen enough chaos to know that speculation was pointless. They would learn their fate when it was decided for them, not before. At night, lying in her bunk while the ship rolled through Atlantic swells, Greta thought about home. Her family's farm in Baden-Württemberg, the apple trees her grandfather had planted, the stone cellar where they stored barrels of fermenting cider. She wondered if any of it still stood. Allied bombing campaigns had been devastating German cities and industrial centers. Rural areas might have been spared, or they might have been destroyed for strategic reasons she couldn't fathom. She had not heard from her family in over a year. The last letter she received, forwarded through military postal channels, had been brief and carefully worded to pass censors. Her mother mentioned difficulties with the harvest. Her father's health was declining. Her younger brother had been conscripted. Standard wartime hardships, expressed in euphemisms that revealed almost nothing. The transport ship docked in Norfolk, Virginia. Greta had never been to America. She knew it only through propaganda, both the German kind that painted Americans as soft and decadent, and the whispered counter-narratives from soldiers who had fought against them and learned to respect their industrial might. The prisoners were processed through a military facility, paperwork, medical examinations, interrogations that were more administrative than hostile. American officers asked about their roles in the military, their skills, their health status. They seemed more interested in classification than punishment. Greta answered honestly. She described her work in food preservation and fermentation. She explained her knowledge of fruit conservation, her experience managing supply logistics. The interrogating officer, a middle-aged captain with a Midwestern accent, took notes without expression. After processing, the prisoners were divided into groups. Assignments were made based on skills and labor needs. Some men were sent to work in factories, others went to agricultural projects. The destination varied, but the pattern was clear. America needed workers, and prisoners of war represented available labor. Greta received a small slip of paper with her assignment typed on it. She stared at the words, reading them twice to make sure she understood correctly. The paper seemed too small to decide a fate so large. Apple orchard, work detail. 4 words that made no sense. Greta showed the paper to the other women in her group. They compared assignments. Most had been designated for textile factories or canneries. One woman, a former army nurse, was assigned to a military hospital to assist with non-critical care under supervision. But Greta's assignment stood out for its strangeness. An apple orchard, not a factory, not a prison labor camp. An orchard. Suspicion came first. Several women suggested it must be a mistake, or perhaps a psychological test. Maybe the Americans wanted to see how they would react to seemingly pleasant assignments before revealing the real punishment. Trust nothing that appears normal, they agreed. This was still war, still captivity, but Greta felt something else stirring beneath the suspicion, recognition. She had grown up among apple trees. Her childhood memories were filled with harvest seasons, the weight of ripe fruit in her hands, the sweet smell of pressed juice, the careful timing required for fermentation. Her expertise in food preservation had begun with her grandmother teaching her how to make apple cider in their cellar, explaining the precise conditions needed for proper fermentation. Still, this seemed too convenient, too perfectly aligned with her background. She remembered a phrase her father used to say, "When something seems too good, look for the catch." In war, especially, nothing came without cost. The journey to the orchard took 2 days by train. Greta and 3 other prisoners, 2 men assigned to agricultural work, and another woman with a similar designation, traveled under light guard. The guards were not hostile. They seemed almost bored, more like escorts than enforcers. Through the train windows, Greta watched America pass by. Cities gave way to farmland. The landscape reminded her of Germany in some ways, rolling hills, organized fields, small towns, but everything seemed bigger, more spread out, less ancient. The buildings were newer, the roads wider. She tried to reconcile this peaceful countryside with the war being fought across the ocean. Here, civilians moved freely. Cars drove without military checkpoints. Shops appeared to be open and stocked. The contrast to bombed-out European cities was jarring. When they arrived at the orchard, Greta's first thought was simple. This looks like home. Rows of apple trees stretched across gentle slopes. Wooden buildings housed equipment and storage. The air smelled of ripening fruit and turned earth. If not for the language barrier and the American flag flying over the main building, she could have believed herself back in Baden-Württemberg. The orchard manager, a weathered man in his 50s named Coleman, greeted them through a translator. He explained the arrangement clearly. They would work 6 days a week, 8 hours per day. Sundays were rest days. They would receive minimal pay, tokens more than true wages, and adequate food and housing. The work was harvest and preservation. The rules were simple: work well, cause no trouble, and the conditions would remain fair. Coleman looked directly at Greta when he mentioned preservation work. Someone had clearly informed him about her background. That night, lying in the simple but clean dormitory assigned to female workers, Greta stared at the ceiling. The other woman from the train, a former factory supervisor from Bavaria, whispered across the dark room, "This is strange." "Yes," Greta agreed. "Do you trust it?" Greta considered the question carefully. "No, but I will work. What else can I do?" Nothing that seemed so normal could be real inside a war. The work began at dawn. Greta joined the other orchard workers, a mix of local hired labor, migrant workers, and prisoners of war, in the fields. The prisoners were easily identified by their clothing, marked with large POW letters. But in practice, the distinction mattered less than she expected. Everyone had a job. Everyone was evaluated by their output. The harvest was in full swing. Rows of trees heavy with apples needed to be picked carefully. Damaged fruit couldn't be stored long-term. Bruised apples spoiled quickly and could contaminate entire storage bins. Speed mattered, but so did care. Greta understood this instinctively. She had grown up knowing that an apple's value depended on how it was handled. She picked with deliberate movements, cradling each fruit as she twisted it free from the branch, placing it gently in her basket rather than dropping it. The first day she expected punishment. Old instincts from military life told her that someone would find fault, that efficiency would never be enough. But no one shouted. No one threatened. The supervisors moved through the rows, observing, making notes, but offering only practical corrections. On the second day, one of the civilian supervisors, a young man named Derek, who had grown up on the orchard, approached Greta during a water break. "You know what you're doing," he said through the translator. Greta nodded carefully. "You've worked with apples before?" "Yes. My family had orchards." "Here in Germany?" Derek studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the storage buildings. "After harvest, what did you do with the fruit?" "We made cider, some vinegar, preserves for winter." His expression changed. Interest replaced casual observation. "Can you do that here?" "If you have the equipment, yes." That conversation shifted everything. By the end of the week, Greta was reassigned from field picking to the processing facility. The orchard had basic equipment for making cider and vinegar, but production had been limited due to lack of expertise. The previous specialist had been drafted into military service. The orchard needed someone who understood fermentation chemistry, someone who could maximize the value extracted from each harvest. Greta found herself in a familiar environment: large wooden barrels, pressing equipment, temperature-controlled storage. The tools were slightly different from what she had used in Germany, but the principles were identical. She began working methodically. First, she assessed the existing inventory. Some barrels contained cider that had been improperly managed, too warm, leading to excessive bacterial growth. She identified what could be salvaged and what needed to be discarded. Then she established protocols for new batches, explaining through the translator how temperature, time, and bacterial cultures needed to be balanced. Coleman watched her work with growing approval. He had been skeptical about using prisoner labor for specialized tasks, but Greta's competence was undeniable. Within 2 weeks, the orchard's cider production had increased significantly, and the quality improved noticeably. For Greta, the strangest part was not the work itself but the atmosphere. No one treated her like an enemy. The guards remained distant but not hostile. The civilian workers who had been initially wary gradually accepted her presence. She was useful, and utility seemed to matter more than nationality. She expected to be broken by the work. Instead, she was being evaluated by it. 3 months into her assignment, Greta had become indispensable. The orchard's cider production had not only increased but improved dramatically in quality. Greta had introduced techniques from German fermentation traditions, specific temperature controls, careful selection of apple varieties for blending, precise timing for pressing. The resulting cider had a complexity that impressed even long-time customers. Coleman began consulting her on broader decisions: which apples should be allocated for cider versus fresh sale? How could storage be optimized to extend the season? What equipment investments would improve efficiency? Through the translator, and increasingly through her improving English, Greta shared her knowledge freely. She had no reason to withhold expertise. The work gave her days structure and purpose. After months of uncertainty and displacement, having a role that utilized her actual skills felt like emerging from fog into clarity. The other prisoners noticed the change in how she was treated. Some resented it. A few of the men made bitter comments about collaboration, about making the enemy's life easier. But most recognized reality. They were all prisoners, and those who proved useful received better conditions. Greta didn't think of it as collaboration. She thought of it as survival through competence. The war had taken everything else from her: home, family contact, autonomy. But it couldn't take her knowledge. That remained hers, and she chose how to use it. One afternoon in late autumn, Coleman brought a visitor to the processing facility. An older man, well-dressed, carrying a leather portfolio. They spoke quietly while observing Greta work, then approached her station. Coleman introduced the visitor as Hayes, who owned several orchards in the region and supplied major distributors. Hayes had tasted the orchard's recent cider and wanted to know about the production methods. Through the translator, Hayes asked detailed questions. Greta answered honestly, explaining the fermentation process, the importance of apple selection, the role of temperature management. Hayes took notes, nodding occasionally. Before leaving, Hayes said something to Coleman that made the orchard manager smile. After the visitor departed, Coleman approached Greta. "He wants to buy our entire cider production for the season," Coleman explained. "He says it's the best he's tasted from this region. He asked who made it." Greta said nothing, unsure how to respond. "I told him we had an expert from Germany," Coleman continued. He found that very interesting. That night, lying in her bunk, Greta felt something she hadn't experienced since before the war: pride in her work. Not pride in serving a cause or following orders, but simple satisfaction in doing something well, in applying knowledge and seeing tangible results. In that orchard, she had stopped being an enemy. She had become necessary. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The news reached the orchard through radio broadcasts that echoed across the workers' dormitory. Greta sat on her bunk, listening to descriptions of celebrations in American cities, of relief and victory, while trying to process what this meant for her. She was no longer an enemy combatant. The war that had defined her status, her captivity, her entire existence for 2 years had ended. But what came next? The legal status of prisoners of war became complicated. Repatriation was expected, but it would take time. Europe was in chaos. Transportation was limited. Millions of displaced people needed to be sorted, processed, returned to places that might no longer exist. Greta received her first letter from Germany in over 18 months. It had been forwarded through Red Cross channels, marked with a dozen routing stamps. Her mother had written it 3 months earlier. The farm was damaged, but standing. Allied bombing had destroyed the barn and part of the main house. Her father had died during the winter. Pneumonia, with no medicine available. Her younger brother was missing, last known to be fighting on the Eastern Front. The orchards had been neglected. There was no harvest. Food was scarce. Her mother was living with relatives in a nearby town. Greta read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of loss. The Germany she had left no longer existed. The farm that represented her entire childhood was a ruin. Her family was scattered or dead. Then came the offer. Coleman approached her one morning as she inspected fermentation barrels. He seemed uncomfortable, choosing words carefully even in English before the translator conveyed the meaning. "The war is over, so technically you should be sent back to Germany," Coleman began. "But the repatriation process will take months, maybe longer. And honestly, I need you here. The orchard needs you." He paused, gauging her reaction. "There's a program for prisoners with specialized skills. If they want to stay in America, Work legally. There's a process. Sponsorship through employers. It's complicated, but it's possible. Greta stared at him, processing the implications. I'm offering you a job, Coleman said simply. A real job, not prisoner labor. A position with wages, housing, a path to legal residency. You'd work here, continue doing what you're already doing. He handed her papers explaining the program. She would need to apply formally, undergo additional background checks, prove her value to the American economy. It wasn't guaranteed, but Coleman's sponsorship gave her a strong case. That night, Greta faced the hardest decision of her life. Return to Germany meant going back to rubble, to grief, to starting over in a country devastated by war. Her mother's letter had made clear there was nothing waiting for her there except hardship. Stay in America meant abandoning her homeland, accepting permanent displacement, building a life in the country that had been her nation's enemy. It meant becoming an immigrant, forever foreign, forever marked by her origins. But it also meant continuation of the life she had begun building here, the work she enjoyed, the competence she had proven, the possibility of a future not defined by loss. She thought about her father's apple trees, now neglected. She thought about the orchard here, thriving under her management. She thought about the cider she was producing, using techniques her grandmother had taught her, adapted to American apples and American tastes. The choice wasn't between Germany and America. It was between the past and the future. She had survived the war. Now she needed to decide what to do with that survival. The paperwork took 8 months, background investigations, character references, proof of employment value. Coleman submitted documents arguing that Greta's expertise was essential to his orchard's operation and profitability. Hayes, the distributor who had bought the previous season's production, wrote a letter supporting her application, noting that her cider had opened new markets for regional products. In January 1946, Greta's application for legal residency was approved. She was no longer a prisoner of war. She was a legal immigrant with a work permit. The transition was strange. The dormitory that had been her prisoner quarters became temporary housing while she saved money. The work that had been forced became chosen. The country that had been her captor became her home. She continued improving the orchard's cider production. Word spread among regional distributors about the quality coming from Coleman's operation. Orders increased. Coleman expanded the processing facility and hired Greta as the production manager with a real salary. By 1948, Greta had saved enough to lease a small plot of land adjacent to Coleman's orchard. She planted her own apple trees, varieties she selected specifically for cider production, combining German cultivars with American stock. It would take years before they matured, but she was planning for the long term now. She began producing her own cider brand, small batch and premium. She called it Weiss cider, using her family name. The label featured a simple design, an apple tree, roots visible, growing from tilled soil. A symbol of transplantation, of growth in new ground. The business grew slowly but steadily. American tastes were different from German preferences. Americans wanted sweeter cider, less dry than traditional European styles. Greta adapted, creating blends that honored her traditional knowledge while appealing to local palates. She experimented with different fermentation techniques, producing variations that ranged from sweet and light to complex and aged. By the 1950s, Weiss cider had regional recognition. It was sold in specialty stores and served at better restaurants. Food writers began mentioning it in reviews. Greta's story, the German prisoner who became a master cider maker, added interest, though she never exploited it for marketing. The product spoke for itself. She became an American citizen in 1951. The ceremony was small, held at a courthouse with a dozen other applicants from various countries. She swore an oath to a constitution she had studied carefully, pledging loyalty to institutions she had come to respect. It felt significant and strange, a formal ending to one identity and the beginning of another. Her mother never left Germany. They corresponded regularly after postal service normalized, but her mother was too old and too attached to what remained of home to make the journey to America. She died in 1954. Greta received a letter from distant relatives explaining that her mother had spoken often of her daughter in America. Proud, but sad about the distance. Greta never married. Relationships formed and faded over the years, but none took hold permanently. She poured her energy into the business, into perfecting her craft, into building something that would last beyond her own life. By the 1960s, Weiss cider employed 12 people and distributed across multiple states. Greta had moved from production into management, training others in the techniques she had refined over decades. Her orchard had expanded to 30 acres. She had become exactly what Coleman had predicted years earlier, indispensable. In 1970, a journalist from a food magazine came to interview her for a feature on American artisan cider makers. He asked about her journey, about how a German prisoner of war had become a respected producer in an American industry. Greta considered the question carefully before answering. "I was captured as part of a war I did not choose," she said. "I could have been sent anywhere, assigned any work. Instead, I was sent to an apple orchard. What seemed like punishment turned out to be salvation. What felt like ending became beginning." She paused, looking out over her orchard, trees heavy with ripening fruit. "The war took my home. America gave me different ground to plant in. The fruit that grows here is not the same as what grew in Germany, but it is still fruit, still good, still mine." The journalist asked if she had ever regretted staying in America rather than returning to Germany. "Regret is the wrong word," Greta replied. "I lost much by staying, but I gained much too. We do not get to choose what history does to us. We only choose what we do after." Margarete Weiss continued producing cider until her death in 1979 at the age of 61. Weiss cider still exists today, now run by the family of her former apprentice. The company maintains her original recipes and techniques, and a small museum at the orchard tells the story of the German prisoner who found freedom among apple trees. The work given to her as prisoner labor became her salvation. The capture that should have ended her life instead opened a door to a future she never imagined. And the cider she made, fermented from American apples using German knowledge, became a bridge between two worlds, proof that even from displacement and defeat, something beautiful could grow. Margarete Weiss was captured as part of a war she did not choose, but the future she built afterward, that was her choice entirely.